Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of hormones.
Yes. And how they really shape our behavior.
Right, moving beyond that simple idea of just, chemical messengers. We know you want to get knowledgeable quickly, thoroughly, without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. And that's the goal here. Understand the core ideas, maybe some surprising links.
So our mission for this deep dive.
First, let's really get a handle on how hormones are different from neurotransmitters. That's key.
Okay.
Then we'll look at what some specific key hormones actually do.
Makes sense.
And finally, we'll unpack a really compelling example, how hormones influence something complex, like, well, memory formation.
Yeah.
All based on the material provided, of course.
Great. Okay, so let's kick things off. That fundamental difference, hormones versus neurotransmitters. What is it?
Okay, so yeah, both are chemicals and both affect behavior. But how they operate is quite different.
How so?
Well, think about neurotransmitters. They're like super local instant messages.
Yeah.
Right between neurons.
Okay, fast and direct.
Exactly. Released by a neuron, zip across that tiny synaptic gap, affect the next neuron. Boom.
And hormones?
Hormones are more like a broadcast system, maybe. They're secreted by glands straight into the bloodstream.
Ah, so they travel further.
Much further, throughout the whole body, looking for their specific target cells. A good example to illustrate this is adrenaline, that's a hormone from the adrenal gland,
Right.
versus something like noradrenaline, which can act as a neurotransmitter in the brain.
Yeah.
Same molecule, different job based on origin.
So neurotransmitters,
Yep.
fast, local. Hormones, slower, wider reach, maybe longer lasting effects. Is that kind of the gist?
That's a really good summary.
Yeah.
Because they have to travel through the blood, hormones definitely take longer to kick in.
Compared to that instant zip across the synapse.
Precisely. But once they find their target cells and bind, their influence tends to stick around much longer than that fleeting neurotransmitter signal.
Okay. So these hormones are floating around in the blood. How do they actually do anything? How do they affect our cells?
Right, they're not just acting randomly. They're looking for specific target cells.
Target cells.
Yeah, and these cells have what we call receptor sites. Think of them like little docking stations, uniquely shaped.
Like a lock and key.
Exactly like a lock and key.
Right.
So only the right hormone can bind to a specific receptor.
And when it binds.
It sends a signal inside that target cell, tells it to either ramp up its activity or, tone it down, increase or decrease its function.
And you mentioned there are loads of these.
Oh, yeah. Over 50 different types of these hormonal keys, influencing just a massive range of behaviors. It's quite remarkable.
50, wow. All happening behind the scenes. Now, you said something earlier that piqued my interest, that the line isn't always totally clear.
Yeah.
How can a hormone act like a neurotransmitter? That seems counterintuitive based on what we just said.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Some hormones have this kind of dual role.
Yeah.
Even though they start in the gland, travel the blood, they can also directly target receptor sites right there in the synaptic gap in the brain, just like a standard neurotransmitter would.
Huh. Can you give an example?
Sure. Think of neuropeptide Y that's made in the hypothalamus. Or oxytocin also starts in the hypothalamus, but the pituitary gland secretes it.
Okay.
Both of those are great examples. They circulate as hormones, but they can also definitely act as neurotransmitters within the brain itself.
So it's like they have two jobs depending on where they are?
Pretty much. It just shows how intricate and, well, flexible our body's communication networks really are.
That's really cool. Okay, let's zoom in on some of these hormones then. Adrenaline, that's the famous one, right? Fight or flight.
The classic, yeah.
Where's it from and what's its main gig beyond just the immediate panic response?
So adrenaline comes from the adrenal glands.
Yeah.
They sit like little hats right on top of your kidneys.
Okay.
And its main job is, yes, arousal. Getting you ready for that fight or flight. Floods the system, gives you that energy burst.
But there's more to it.
There is. What's really interesting, and we'll come back to this, is its role in forming emotional memories.
Emotional memories. Intriguing. So it helps lock in those intense moments.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
When something really emotionally charged happens, adrenaline helps make that memory stronger, more vivid.
Oh, okay. Fascinating. What about cortisol? We hear about that one a lot with stress, too.
Cortisol, yeah, also from the adrenal glands. It's got a bit more of a diverse portfolio.
Okay.
It helps regulate blood sugar, manages metabolism, reduces inflammation, and interestingly, it also seems to support memory formation.
Another memory link.
Yeah, though maybe its influence is a bit different from adrenaline's direct hit on emotional stuff. More supportive, perhaps.
Right, okay. And then melatonin, sleep hormone, right?
That's the one. Melatonin comes from the pineal gland deep in the brain.
And its job.
Basically signals your body it's time to wind down. It encourages relaxation, helps lower body temperature,
Yeah.
cues that are really crucial for falling asleep.
Got it.
Hmm.
Now, you mentioned neuropeptide Y earlier. Hypothalamus acts like a neurotransmitter. What does it do?
Neuropeptide Y, or NPY, it does quite a lot, actually. It stimulates appetite, so it's involved in telling you you're hungry.
Okay.
But it also seems to reduce anxiety and stress, can even lower pain perception.
Wow. Multi-talented.
And there's more. It's linked to our circadian rhythm, our internal body clock. And interestingly, higher levels of NPY seem to be connected to greater resilience.
Resilience, like bouncing back from stress.
Exactly. It's like this molecule might be helping us cope better. Really fascinating area.
Yeah, it is. And then oxytocin, the love hormone, they call it.
That's a popular name, yeah.
Yeah.
Also starts in the hypothalamus, secreted via the pituitary gland.
And in the brain, it acts as a neurotransmitter.
Correct. And its most famous role is in mother-child bonding, that initial attachment.
And it's broader than that.
It's believed to be really important for social bonding in general. Trust between people, group cohesion, that sort of thing.
Okay. And finally, testosterone. Often linked with aggression. What's the real story there?
Testosterone, yeah, mostly from the testes. It definitely plays a facilitative role in aggressive behavior.
Facilitative. Meaning
it doesn't just like flick a switch and cause aggression directly. It's not that simple.
Right.
But higher levels of testosterone are often correlated with higher levels of aggressive tendencies. It makes aggression more likely, perhaps, but it's complex. Many factors involved.
Understood. Not a simple cause and effect. Okay, so we've got this whole orchestra of hormones and neurotransmitters. Let's circle back to fight or flight. You called it a hormone cascade. Can you walk us through that? What happens when we sense danger?
Absolutely. It's a perfect example of this system in action, specifically the HPA axis.
HPA.
Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So, step one, your brain perceives a threat, something scary.
Okay.
That activates the hypothalamus, a key control center in the brain.
Right.
The hypothalamus then sends a signal down to the pituitary gland, another little gland at the base of the brain.
Pituitary gets the message. Then what?
The pituitary releases its own hormone into the bloodstream. That hormone travels down to the adrenal glands, remember, on top of the kidneys.
Got it.
And that signal tells the adrenal glands, go time. Release cortisol and adrenaline.
Ah, so that's the cascade. Hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal glands, cortisol and adrenaline release.
You got it. Into the bloodstream they go.
And these are the hormones that cause all those physical feelings, pounding heart, fast breathing.
Exactly. Cortisol's main job right then is mobilizing energy, dumps glucose into the blood so your muscles have fuel.
For fighting or fleeing.
Precisely. And adrenaline gives you that immediate kick. Heart rate up, breathing faster, blood pressure increases. Everything to help you survive right now.
It's an amazing survival mechanism, really. Fast and effective.
Absolutely evolved to keep us safe.
Now, you mentioned adrenaline and memory earlier, specifically emotional memory. This takes us to that Cahill and McGaugh study from '95. What were they looking into?
Right, Cahill and McGough. They were zeroing in on the role of adrenaline and the amygdala.
The amygdala, the brain's emotion center.
Kind of, yeah, heavily involved in processing emotions, especially fear. They wanted to see if adrenaline triggered by an emotional event actually boosts our memory for that event.
Makes intuitive sense. How did they test it?
It was quite clever. They had two groups of people look at a series of 12 slides. Both groups saw the same slides.
Okay.
But they heard different stories narrated alongside the slides. One group heard a pretty dull story, something about a routine hospital visit, a disaster drill, kind of boring.
Neutral.
Yeah. The other group heard a much more emotionally intense story. It involved a car accident, a boy getting injured, some graphic details. Remember, same visuals, different story context.
Ah, so one story was designed to be emotionally arousing, the other wasn't.
Exactly. Then later, they tested everyone's memory for the details of the story and the slides.
And what did they find in that first part?
Just as you might expect, the group that heard the emotional story remembered way more specific details, both from the story itself and from the slides they saw.
So emotions seem to enhance the memory encoding.
It's strongly suggested that, yeah, we do tend to remember emotional events better.
But how did they prove it was adrenaline doing the enhancing?
That's where the follow-up study comes in. It's the really crucial part.
Okay.
They repeated the experiment, but only with the emotional, traumatic story. This time, though, some participants who heard that story were given a beta blocker drug called propranolol shortly after.
A beta blocker, what does that do?
Beta blockers interfere with adrenaline's effects in the body. They basically block the receptors that adrenaline binds to. And importantly here, they can prevent the activation of the amygdala by adrenaline.
So they were trying to block the adrenaline amygdala connection for the emotional story group.
Precisely. Some got the beta blocker, others got a placebo, a sugar pill.
And the results of that follow-up, what happened to the memory of the beta blocker group?
This was the clincher. The participants who got the beta blocker, even though they heard the same traumatic story, their memory recall was no better than the group who heard the original boring story.
Wow, so blocking the adrenaline wiped out the memory boost from the emotion.
It seemed to, yeah. Their memory for the emotional event was significantly worse than the emotional story group who didn't get the beta blocker.
That is really powerful evidence. What did Cahill and McGough conclude from all this?
Their big takeaway was that adrenaline and the amygdala activation it causes plays a really significant role in creating those strong, lasting memories that are tied to emotional experiences.
And because it was a controlled experiment.
They could argue for a cause and effect relationship. Adrenaline surge, amygdala activation, enhanced emotional memory.
Compelling stuff. Now, okay, that's fascinating lab research. But does it mean anything out in the real world? Can we actually use this knowledge?
That's always the critical question, isn't it? And yes, there's research suggesting it might be applicable, specifically looking at PTSD.
Post-traumatic stress disorder. How does this connect?
Well, think about it. PTSD often involves incredibly vivid, intrusive memories of a traumatic event. Those are powerful emotional memories.
Right.
So researchers wondered, what if we could intervene shortly after a trauma, using something like a beta blocker to dampen that adrenaline surge and maybe prevent those super strong maladaptive memories from consolidating?
You mean potentially prevent PTSD from developing?
That was the idea. A study by Pittman and colleagues back in 2002 tried just that.
How do they do it?
They went into emergency rooms. They found patients who had just experienced a significant trauma, like a bad car accident.
Okay.
And within a few hours of the trauma, they gave some patients propranolol, same beta blocker, and others a placebo.
A real-world test of the Cahill and McGough principle.
Pretty much.
And the results. What did they find down the line?
When they followed up with the patients 1 month later, the group who had received the beta blocker showed significantly fewer symptoms of PTSD compared to the placebo group.
Really? So it seemed to help.
It suggested that, yes, for some people, intervening early with a beta blocker might reduce the likelihood or severity of PTSD developing. It's not a magic bullet, of course. Lots of factors are involved in PTSD.
But still, that's a remarkable potential application. Taking that basic science about adrenaline and memory and potentially helping people avoid long-term suffering.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how understanding these fundamental hormonal mechanisms can possibly translate into real-world interventions.
Wow. Well, this has truly been a deep dive. We've really clarified those key differences, hormones versus neurotransmitters.
The slow broadcast versus the fast message.
Exactly. And explored the jobs of key players like adrenaline, cortisol, melatonin, NPY, oxytocin, testosterone. Quite a cast of characters.
Each with its own specific roles, influencing so much.
And then connecting it all to that fascinating link between adrenaline and how we form emotional memories thanks to Cahill and McGough's work.
Yeah, and the amygdala's role in that.
And seeing how that basic research, like in the Pittman study, might even offer hope for preventing conditions like PTSD. It's just incredible, the power packed into these tiny chemical signals.
It really is. We've gone from the basics of how they signal to what individual ones do, and right into how they shape something as fundamental as our memories of emotional events. It shows that deep interplay between our biology and, well, our life stories.
So as we wrap up, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Given everything we've discussed today, especially about adrenaline and memory, how might these hormonal tides be shaping your own personal history, selecting which memories get burned and bright and which ones fade, all based on emotional intensity? It kind of makes you wonder about the biological underpinnings of your own life story, doesn't it? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.